His mother never called it wisdom. She called it watching the wind. He was 7 years old the first time she took him to the chicken shed before first frost. It was late October in Norway, the surface ground already stiffening under early ice, but inside the shed where she had packed straw tight against every board, the air held a stillness that felt like a held breath. He remembered the sweet dry dust smell of the cut stalks. He remembered the prick through his mittens as she pressed his hand against the wall. He remembered the lamplight turning chaff gold and the way the draft simply stopped at the seam where straw met wood. "The wind is not the cold," she said. "The wind is what carries the cold inside." 31 years later, alone on a Dakota claim with a dead wife and a woodpile too small to survive what was coming, he would remember that lesson, and he would stake everything on it. He had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1881 with Marta beside him and $43 sewn into her underskirt. 6 years later, she died in the last week of August, with the infant dying the same night. The childbed fever took them both before Jonas could ride for help. He buried them together in soil so hard, he broke 2 shovel handles finishing the grave. That left him alone on a quarter section east of the Missouri Coteau with $27, one undersized cabin, a drafty barn holding 2 horses and 1 milk cow and 4 pigs, a smokehouse with late pork still to preserve, and a woodpile too small for what was coming. He could not leave. The filing fees were paid. The improvements were made. Walking away meant losing everything he and Marta had built for 6 years. There was no family to return to, no money for passage back east, no skill except the one skill the frontier demanded: survive. The neighbor nearest to him lived nearly 3 miles away. No one was coming to help. 3 weeks after the burial, Elias Rourke rode up the track. Rourke was 61 years old. He had hauled freight across the northern plains before the railroad came, and spent 12 winters on line camps where men died if they made mistakes. Now he inspected claims for the land office, and his reputation was simple. He saw weak operations, and he said so. Jonas watched him dismount and walk the property without greeting. Rourke studied the cabin first, then the barn, then the smokehouse sitting 40 yards from the cabin door, then the woodpile. He walked the whole circuit before he spoke. "Your wife is dead," Rourke said. It was not a question. 3 weeks. Rourke nodded. He looked at the woodpile again. "How much do you have stacked?" "Maybe 2 cords, a little more." "You need 6 minimum for a hard winter, 8 if January turns savage." Rourke pointed at the barn. "Those slats leak. I can see daylight through them from here. Your stock will lose heat faster than you can replace it." Jonas said nothing. "The smokehouse is too far," Rourke continued. "When the wind comes off the coteau, you will not be able to cross that yard without losing fingers. Every trip you make bleeds heat from the cabin stove. Every trip costs you time. Every trip costs you strength." He turned to face Jonas directly. "You are one man, no grown sons, no hired hand. The nearest dependable neighbor is Sorensen, and he has his own stock to tend." "I know the math," Jonas said. "Then you know it does not work." Rourke pulled his gloves back on. "When the north wind turns, your stock will freeze in the dark, and you will follow them." He mounted his horse. "I have seen stronger claims fail with more wood and more hands. This one is not strong. You should consider selling while the stock is still worth something." Jonas watched him ride away. The September wind moved across the open ground between the cabin and the barn, and he felt it cut through his coat as if the coat were paper. He tried the conventional methods first because they were all he knew. He caulked the cabin seams with mud and rags, pushing the mixture into every crack he could find until his fingers cracked and bled. He hung extra hides over the door, layering them so they overlapped. He banked manure and frozen earth against the barn base, working until his back locked up and he had to lie on the cabin floor for an hour before he could move again. He cut more poles for windbreak fencing. He stacked them in rows on the north side of the barn where the wind hit hardest. The poles helped. The wind still came through. Every act cost daylight. Every act cost strength. None of it solved the central problem. The problem was not the cabin. The problem was not the barn. The problem was not the smokehouse. The problem was the space between them. Each trip to tent stock bled heat from the cabin. Each trip to check the smokehouse meant leaving the stove unattended. Each trip across the open yard cost Jonas warmth from his own body that he could not replace fast enough. He was not failing in one place. He was failing in the 40 yards between places. October came. The mornings frosted hard. The light changed. The grass turned pale and brittle. Jonas counted days like a man counting coins in his palm. The first true storm could come in November. It could come in December. It could come any day, the sky decided. He did not know when. He only knew he was not ready. The idea came to him during a night feeding. He was crossing from the cabin to the barn in crosswind, his lantern guttering, his face turned away from the blast. The wind was not severe by January standards. It was only a common October wind, but it cut through him as if he wore nothing. He reached the barn and ducked inside. The horses shifted. The cow lowed. The pigs grunted in their corner. Jonas stood in the dark and felt his hands begin to warm. That was when he noticed the hay. He had a stack of it against the north wall of the barn, bales piled chest high for winter feed. The wind struck the barn's north wall with its usual force. But on the lee side of the haystack, the air was different, quieter, warmer against his face. He stood there for a long time. He thought about his mother in Norway, packing straw against the chicken shed before first frost. He thought about the sweet, dry dust smell of cut straw. He thought about the prick of stalks through his mittens as a boy. He thought about the lamplight turning chaff gold and the sudden stillness when the draft stopped. Not all warmth comes from adding heat. Some comes from trapping it. Some comes from denying the wind a path. He walked back to the cabin through the crosswind and felt every foot of open ground steal something from him. 40 yards. It might as well have been a mile. The design came to him in pieces over the following days. He did not need to heat the whole outside. He needed to protect the movement routes. He needed dead air chambers. He needed short passages. He needed to connect the buildings in a way that let him move between them without surrendering himself to the wind. He could use what he already had in quantity: hay, poles, planks, rawhide, stakes, 2 narrow corridors, one from cabin to barn, one from cabin to smokehouse, stacked hay bales on both sides packed tight, plank flooring to keep the passage mud-free, hide and pole roofing low enough to shed wind, closable flap openings at each end, small vents near the barn, and so stale air and animal damp did not foul the passage. He was not going to heat 3 separate buildings to room temperature from one stove. That was impossible. But he could create an insulated movement system, a heat buffer, a way to let the cabin fire, warm air leakage, animal body heat, and reduced wind exposure work together to keep the connected spaces survivable, with far less fuel. He began sketching the design on a scrap of board with a charred stick. The corridors would be about 4 feet wide inside, walls chest high on a man, roof low enough to shed wind but high enough to walk upright. Entry flaps weighted to stay closed, venting controlled so he could open or close it as needed. It could work. It had to work. Because if it did not work, Rourke was right. The stock would freeze in the dark and Jonas would follow them. Nels Sorensen came by on a supply run the 3rd week of October. Sorensen was a homesteader of similar age, steady and practical, with a wife and 3 children and a claim that was better established than Jonas's. He was not an unkind man, but he was not a man who believed in gambles. He looked at the stakes Jonas had driven into the ground between the cabin and the barn. He looked at the pile of poles and planks Jonas had collected. He looked at the hay bales Jonas had dragged from the barn and stacked in 2 rows. "What are you building?" Sorensen asked. "A passage. Cabin to barn. Another from cabin to smokehouse." Sorensen was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man hearing something that sounded foolish. "You are building hallways out of feed." "I'm building shelter from the wind." "That hay is feed. You need it for your stock. If you wall it up, your horses will starve before March." "If I do nothing, they will freeze before January." Sorensen shook his head. "Hay gets wet. Wet hay rots. Wet hay burns." He pointed at the stakes. "And tunnels drift shut. One good storm, and you will have 8 feet of snow packed against your passage walls. The whole thing will collapse. The roof will be pitched to shed. Animals need air, not trapped damp. You close them in with the barn, and you will have sickness before spring." Sorensen walked to the nearest hay bale and pressed his hand against it. "This is soft. The wind will tear through it." Jonas knelt by the bale and lit a candle. He held it at different points along the surface and watched the flame. At the top, where the bale was looser, the flame flickered. Lower, where the straw was packed tight, the flame held steady. "Tight packing," Jonas said. "That is the key. The wind moves through loose straw. It does not move through tight straw." Sorensen watched him. His expression was the expression of a man watching something he did not understand and did not trust. "You have lost your wife," Sorensen said quietly. "That can make a man think strange thoughts. I have counted the wood. I have counted the trips. I have counted the heat." Jonas stood up. "The math does not work the old way, so I'm trying a new way. And if it fails, then I will be dead, and you can tell everyone you warn me." Sorensen left without saying goodbye. Jonas watched him ride away, then turned back to the stakes and the bales and the work that waited. The first confrontation with Silas Bender came the following week. Bender owned the general store in the nearest settlement, 8 miles away. He also held notes on half the claims in the district. Jonas owed him for lamp oil, nails, and winter flour. The debt was not large, but it was enough to give Bender power. Jonas rode in for supplies and found Bender waiting behind his counter with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I heard about Marta," Bender said. "A hard thing, a very hard thing." Jonas nodded. "I also heard you are walling up hay instead of feeding scents." Bender leaned forward on the counter. "Building passages, they say. Tunnels, like a man who has lost his grip." "I am solving a problem." "You are using feed for walls. That is not solving. That is wasting." Bender's smile widened. "I could extend you credit for coal oil, enough to keep fires in 2 buildings. That might help more than straw hallways." "At what rate?" 10% over standard." Jonas did the math in his head. 10% over standard was punishing. It would trap him in debt through the following summer, maybe longer. "No," he said. Bender's smile faded. "You owe me $22 already. Lamp oil, nails, flour. That debt is due before February." "I know when it is due." "Then you know what happens if you cannot pay." Bender's voice dropped. "I could buy that cow from you now, the smokehouse pork too. Fair prices. It would clear your balance." Jonas understood what Bender was doing. If he sold the cow and the pork, he would have no milk and no preserved meat through winter. He would be dependent on Bender for supplies, and Bender would set the prices. "No," Jonas said again. "You are making a mistake." Bender's voice was soft. "When the cold comes, you will wish you had listened. Straw does not stop blizzards. Straw burns, and when it burns, everything burns with it." Jonas paid for the supplies he had come for and left without looking back. He met Ada Mercer on the 4th day of November. She was 56 years old, a Civil War quartermaster's widow, living with her married daughter several miles to the west. People in the district called her when things needed solving. She knew packing, she knew storage, she knew airflow, she knew how to make low-grade materials do disciplined work. She did not come to help. She came because she had heard a fool was wasting hay, and she wanted to see whether he was a fool. Jonas saw her walking his property before he heard her speak. She was a small woman, thin and straight-backed, wearing a coat that had seen 20 winters and a hat that did not match. She walked the length of his first corridor section, the cabin-to-barn run, half-built, and pressed her hand against the hay wall the way Sorensen had done. But unlike Sorensen, she did not step back. "Too loose," she said, without looking at him. Jonas walked over. "The packing?" "The packing." She pushed her fingers into the bale's surface. "You have air channels running through here, 2, 3 inches deep. Wind will find them." She pulled her hand out. "Loose hay insulates like a blanket with holes. Tight hay insulates like a wall." "How tight?" "Tight enough that you cannot push a knife blade through without force." She walked to another section and pressed again. "Here. Better. But not good enough." Jonas felt something shift inside him. Sorensen had laughed. Bender had threatened. Rourke had predicted death. But this woman was not laughing or threatening or predicting. She was correcting. "You know this work," he said. "My husband ran quartermaster supply for 3 winters during the war. I learned what he learned." She turned to look at him for the first time. "A man who watches wind and tests drafts before he speaks. That is not a fool. That is a man thinking." "Sorensen says I have lost my grip." "Sorensen builds the way his father built and his grandfather built. That works when the conditions match." She walked to the end of the first corridor and studied the frame. "When the conditions do not match, you adapt or you die." She pushed against a corner post. It shifted. "This is wrong," she said. "The post should cant inward slightly. Wind load pushes outward. You need resistance leaning into the pressure." Jonas had not thought of that. "Your roof hides." She pointed. "They overlap the wrong direction. Water will run into the seam instead of away from it. Wet straw is dead straw. You need to relay them." Jonas felt his face heat with shame. "Do not waste time on shame," Ada said. "Waste time on correction." She pulled off her gloves. "Show me your door flaps." Ada returned 3 more times over the following weeks. Each visit was a scene. Each scene was a lesson. On her second visit, she made Jonas tear down and rebuild the first wall of the cabin-to-barn corridor. He had stacked the bales in courses like bricks, which seemed logical. She showed him that courses created horizontal seams where wind could finger through. "Stagger them," she said. "Break the seam line every second layer, overlap the joints." She watched him restack 3 rows before she nodded. "Better, tighter, again." He restacked the next 3 rows while she watched. His shoulders ached, his hands blistered through his gloves. He did not complain. On her 3rd visit, she taught him about controlled openings. Every doorway needed overlap flaps and weighted closure. A corridor lost value if each end leaked like an open throat. "You cannot seal it completely," she said. "Stock needs air, smoke needs to vent, but you control where the air moves." She showed him how to hang double hides with a gap between them, so anyone passing through had to push through 2 layers instead of 1. An airlock. The outside layer opens. The inside layer stays closed. You pass through. The outside layer closes. Then the inside layer opens. 2 movements instead of 1, Jonas said. 2 movements, but the warm air inside never meets the cold air outside directly. The gap between the hides holds a pocket, a buffer. Jonas thought about this. Like the whole corridor is a buffer between the cabin and the barn. Ada smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, barely visible. Now you understand. On her fourth visit, she taught him how to set breathing points near the livestock end of the barn corridor. Small gaps covered with loose woven cloth, positioned low where damp air would settle and high where warmth would rise. The gaps allowed airflow without creating wind channels. Stillness, she said. Not ceiling, stillness. You are not building warmth. You are building stillness. Jonas repeated the phrase to himself that night. You are not building warmth. You are building stillness. It became his doctrine. November brought harder frosts. December brought the first real snow. Jonas worked through both. He cut willow and cottonwood poles from the creek ribbon and dragged them back to the claim on a makeshift sledge. He pulled planks from a broken wagon box and the floor of an old shed. He stacked hay into thick walls held by driven stakes and cross-lashed rails. The work broke down into stages. Week 1, cabin to barn corridor stakes and floor. The floor was crucial. Without it, the passage would become mud in any thaw and ice and any freeze. Week 2, first wall to chest height. The hay bales were heavier than they looked, and stacking them with proper stagger and overlap was slower than Jonas expected. Week 3, roofed half run. The hide and pole roofing had to be pitched correctly to shed snow, and Jonas made 3 attempts before Ada approved the angle. Week 4, smokehouse run started. The second corridor was shorter. Cabin to smokehouse was only 30 feet, but the angle was harder because the smokehouse sat on slightly higher ground. Week 5, first full sheltered passage complete by lantern test. Jonas walked from the cabin to the barn at midnight without his coat and arrived with his face still warm. But there were setbacks. The first hide roof tore loose in an early wind. Jonas had not weighted the edges heavily enough. He spent a full day resetting the poles and lashing the hides with doubled rawhide cord. A pig escaped and got into a haystack. It rooted through 2 bales before Jonas caught it, ruining a section of the barn corridor wall. He had to repack the damaged portion with loose straw stuffed tight by hand. He sliced his palm on a draw knife while cutting poles. The wound took 3 days to close and slowed his grip for a week, and Nels Sorensen was proven partly right. Trapped damp began to sour a corner of the barn corridor wall where the roof pitch was too shallow. Jonas had to tear out the affected section and rebuild with better drainage underneath. Each setback cost time. Each setback cost strength. Each setback made him wonder whether Bender was right, whether the whole thing would come down in the first real storm and leave him worse off than before. But each setback also taught him something, and Ada was there to make sure the lessons took. Bender called in part of the debt on the 15th of December. Jonas rode to the store expecting to buy salt. He found Bender waiting with a ledger open on the counter. $12, Bender said. Due now, per our agreement. The agreement said February. The agreement said February for the full balance. The lamp oil portion was due on demand. Bender smiled. I am demanding. Jonas had $11 in cash. He had goods he could sell. But selling goods in December meant selling at winter prices, which meant selling at a loss. I can pay $8 now, Jonas said. The rest by end of month. $8 now and $4 by end of month. Bender's smile widened. With interest. How much interest? 5%. Jonas did the math. $4 at 5% for 2 weeks was not ruinous, but it meant less margin for anything else that went wrong. He paid the $8. He signed for the balance. He left the store without buying salt. That night, he lay on his cabin floor and stared at the ceiling and thought about Marta. She had been the one who kept the books. She had been the one who tracked the debts and the credits and the margins. Without her, he was running blind. But he was still running. The corridors were nearly complete. The barn passage was functional. The smokehouse passage needed another week of work, maybe less. He had converted feed into shelter, risk into design, loneliness into labor. Rourke had said the stock would freeze and Jonas would follow. Sorensen had said the hay would rot and burn. Bender had said the cold would force him to his knees. None of them had said, build stillness. None of them had seen what Ada saw. By the end of December, the system stood complete. Cabin to barn, enclosed. Cabin to smokehouse, enclosed. Double flap entries at each junction. Tighter, restacked hay on the windward sides. Raised plank floor through the main route. Venting adjusted at the livestock end. Smokehouse door baffled to reduce heat dump during entry. Jonas tested the system every night for a week. Lantern flame, steadier inside the corridor than outside. Water bucket, left near the corridor wall, it skinned over with ice slower than a bucket left in the open yard. Body temperature. Jonas could cross from cabin to barn in shirt sleeves for short intervals. In the old days, that same crossing required full layering and still left him cold. Stove fuel. The cabin stove burned fewer armloads per day than before the corridors were complete. The innovation was working, in calm weather, in light wind, in the easy cold of late December. But the skeptics had not yielded. Nels Sorensen came by to look. He admitted the passage blocked wind. He admitted the floor stayed dry, but he shook his head anyway. A trick that works in calm weather is no test. Wait until the real wind comes. Wait until the drifts pile 8 feet high. Then we will see. Elias Rourke rode past on his inspection rounds. He dismounted and walked the barn corridor from end to end. He pressed the hay walls. He examined the roof lashing. He checked the floor seams. Clever, he said when he was done. But January has not come. Rourke mounted his horse. I have seen clever things fail. I have seen clever men die. Clever is not the same as sound. Bender sent word through a passing freighter. Tell the fool I will buy his stock when the corridors burn. The warning signs began on January 11th. The barometer dropped. The sky turned a strange color, brass and pale and too still. The noon air felt warm, warmer than it should have been for January. Animals moved oddly. Birds flew low. The crusted snow on the ground softened slightly at the surface, then refroze after sunset into a shell that cracked underfoot. Jonas walked his corridors and checked every lash point by hand. He stored emergency water in the cabin and the barn. He brought extra feed into the barn passage so he would not have to cross open ground to the main stack. He secured the smokehouse vent in the half-open position. Ada came by late that afternoon. She walked the corridors in silence. She pressed the walls. She checked the door flaps. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The dangerous storm is the one that arrives after a misleading calm." "You think it is coming?" "I think the sky looks wrong. I think the air feels wrong." She looked at him directly. "I think you have done what can be done. Now we wait." She left before sunset. Jonas watched her wagon disappear down the track and felt a cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. January 12th began almost tolerable. The morning was cold but not bitter. The wind was present but not violent. Jonas did his morning chores, feeding, watering, checking the stove, and noticed nothing unusual. Then, around midday, the light changed. He was in the barn corridor when he heard it. A sound in the barn boards. A different sound. Not the creak of cold wood. Not the rattle of loose slats. Something deeper. a pressure change, a vibration. He stepped outside the corridor entrance and looked north. The sky was coming apart. A wall of white was moving toward the claim, not snow falling, snow flying, horizontal, violent, solid as a breaking wave. Behind it, the temperature was dropping so fast he could feel the change in his face before the wall reached him. 60 degrees. 70. The thermometer was inside. He did not need it. He knew. The wall hit. Everything went wrong at once. The wind struck the claim like a physical blow. Jonas staggered back into the barn corridor as the blast tore at his coat. Snow filled the air so thick he could not see the barn wall 10 feet away. The temperature plunged through zero and kept falling. He crawled to the barn end of the corridor and heard the horses screaming. Inside the barn, the mare was panicking. She kicked at the stall dividers, her hooves cracking against wood. The sound was deafening. The other horse was rearing, pulling at its tether. The cow had backed into a corner and would not move. The pigs were squealing. Jonas grabbed a lantern from the corridor hook and pushed through the barn flap. The wind had found a gap in the slats, a seam he had caulked in September that had worked loose, and cold air was streaming in like water through a breached hull. He grabbed a horse blanket and stuffed it into the gap. The blanket held. The mare stopped kicking, but she was still wild-eyed, and he knew he had to calm her before she hurt herself or broke through the wall. He tied a cloth over her eyes and spoke to her in the low voice Marta had used with frightened animals. Norwegian words, meaningless sounds. The mare's breathing slowed. Her muscles stopped trembling. Then he heard the roof. Not the barn roof, the corridor roof, the smokehouse passage. A section was lifting at one seam, flapping in the wind like a wounded wing. If that section tore free, the whole smokehouse corridor would be compromised. Snow would fill it. Wind would tunnel through. He would lose protected access to the preserved meat. He crawled back through the barn corridor, through the cabin, and into the smokehouse passage. The flapping section was near the far end, closest to the smokehouse door. He could see it in the dim light, the hide roof lifting and falling with each gust. He had no ladder. He had no extra hands. He had only himself and whatever he could reach. He braced his shoulder against the hay wall and climbed. His hands found the roof pole. He pulled himself up until his head was level with the tier. The wind was trying to peel the hide away from the lashing. If the lashing broke, the section would be gone. He did not have time to relash it properly. He had time for one thing: wait. He dropped back down and grabbed the first heavy object he could find, a wooden crate filled with smoking hooks and chains. He dragged it to the wall, climbed again, and wedged it onto the roof between the pole and the hide. Then another crate, then a coil of rope, then a burlap sack filled with sand he had stored for icy patches. The section stopped flapping. The weight held. The corridor held. He crawled back to the cabin and found the door flap at the cabin end had frozen half open. Cold air was pouring in, and the stove was guttering. He tore at the frozen flap with his bare hands. His fingers burned. His skin cracked. The hide came loose with a sound like tearing meat. He slammed the weighted edge down and held it until the ice seal reset. The stove roared back to life. Outside, somewhere on the road, voices were shouting. Jonas pushed through the barn corridor and cracked the outer flap. He could see nothing but white, but he could hear them, 2 voices, maybe 3, shouting against the wind. They were Bender's men, the hired team that ran supplies to outlying claims. They had been on the road when the storm hit. They were lost. Jonas shouted back. His voice vanished in the wind. He shouted again, again. A shape emerged from the white, a man, staggering, ice on his face and hands. Behind him, another shape, a horse, barely standing, dragging an empty sledge. Jonas grabbed the first man and pulled him into the barn corridor. The man collapsed against the hay wall, gasping. "The other one," the man choked. "Hansen. He went down. 100 yards back, maybe. Could not see." Jonas did not hesitate. He grabbed a rope from the barn, tied one end to the corridor entrance post, and pushed back into the white. The rope played out behind him as he walked. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. He could not see his own hands. He could not feel his face. He could only feel the rope and the wind and the terrible knowledge that a man was dying somewhere in front of him. He found Hansen face down in a drift. The man was not moving. Jonas grabbed him by the coat and dragged him backward, following the rope, counting the steps. 60 feet, 40 feet, 20 feet. He pulled Hansen into the barn corridor and slammed the flap shut. Hansen was breathing, barely. His lips were blue, his hands were white, but he was breathing. Jonas dragged both men through the corridor into the cabin. He stripped off their frozen coats. He wrapped them in blankets. He fed them warm water, then warmer water, then hot water with sugar dissolved in it. The first man, his name was Polk, stopped shivering after an hour. Hansen took longer, but by nightfall, both men were sitting up, drinking broth and staring at the cabin walls as if they had never seen walls before. "We would be dead," Polk said, "if you had not heard us, if you had not come out." "The corridor," Jonas said. "The corridor let me get to you without losing myself." Polk looked at him with something like wonder. "You built a road through the storm." The storm did not stop for 3 days. Jonas worked without rest. He crossed to the barn every 4 hours through the corridor, tending the stock, checking the structure, watching for new damage. He crossed to the smokehouse every 6 hours, checking the preserved meat, adjusting the vent, making sure the passage stayed clear. He was not crossing open yard. He was not exposing the cabin stove every trip. He was not losing himself to the wind. He was moving through stillness. On the second night, a drift collapsed against the smokehouse end of that corridor. The pressure bowed the hay wall inward. Jonas heard the crack and felt his heart stop. If that passage failed, he lost the meat. If he lost the meat, he lost the margin that let him survive until spring. But Ada had taught him, and he remembered. He cut relief slits in the drift pressure from inside the passage, digging through the hay wall at strategic points to let the snow settle instead of push. He braced the bowed section with spare planks and a butchered hog rail he had stored in the smokehouse for emergency repairs. He cleared the vent paths before the trapped moisture could sour the enclosed air. The wall held. The passage held. The system held. When the storm finally broke on January 15th, Jonas stood at the cabin door and looked at his claim. Snow covered everything. Drifts rose 8 feet high against the windward walls. The barn roof was buried to the ridgeline on one side. The smokehouse was invisible under a white mound, but the corridors were standing. The animals were alive. The meat was preserved. The cabin stove had burned fewer armloads in 3 days than it would have burned in 2 under the old method. Jonas was still standing. Later that week, he heard what had happened to others. The Lindquist family, 3 miles to the southeast, had lost orientation between house and barn. The father had tried to cross during the first night. He had been found 100 yards from his own door, frozen, his hand reaching toward a building he could not see. The Swenson claim had lost all their stock. The barn had not been banked properly, and the wind had torn through the slats and frozen the animals where they stood. A child on the Erickson place had developed frostbite on both hands after being caught outside when the storm hit. The family had survived, but the boy would lose fingers. These were the measured costs of conventional methods. These were the prices paid by people who had done what Rourke and Sorensen and Bender said was sound. Jonas had done something unsound, and he was alive. His stock was alive. His meat was preserved. Two men who would have died in the road were recovering in his cabin. The corridors had not solved winter. They had not turned January mild, but they had given him something no one else on that plane had possessed. Time. Time to tend. Time to recover. Time to move without losing himself. You are not building warmth. You are building stillness. Ada had been right, and the storm had proved it. The morning after the storm broke, Elias Rourke rode up the track. Jonas was clearing snow from the barn corridor entrance when he saw the horse picking its way through the drifts. Rourke dismounted slowly, like a man expecting to find wreckage. He did not find wreckage. He found animal tracks only inside sheltered access. No frozen hoofprints in the open yard, no desperate paths between buildings. He found heat still banked in the cabin stove, the fire burning low and steady instead of roaring against constant cold intrusion. He found a man who had tended 3 critical spaces through a 3-day blizzard without losing himself to the yard. Rourke walked the barn corridor from end to end. He pressed the hay walls, the same walls he had dismissed in December. He examined the door flaps. He checked the floor seams. He studied the repaired section where the drift had bowed the smokehouse passage inward. Jonas watched him and said nothing. When Rourke finished his inspection, he stood at the corridor junction where the 2 passages met at the cabin entrance. He looked at the weighted flaps. He looked at the controlled venting. He looked at the system that had done what no system on that plane was supposed to do. "I thought the wind would take you," Rourke said. Jonas waited. "It was the wind you took away." Rourke did not smile. He did not apologize for his earlier prediction. He was not that kind of man. But he stood in the corridor that should not have worked and admitted that it had worked, and for Elias Rourke, that was as close to conversion as anyone was likely to see. "How did you know?" Rourke asked. "I did not know. I calculated. I tested. I built." Jonas gestured at the hay walls. "And I had help. The Mercer woman. She taught me what I did not know. The rest was labor." Rourke nodded slowly. He walked back through the corridor toward his horse, then stopped at the entrance. "The Lindquist boy died trying to reach his barn," Rourke said. "His father found him 100 yards from the house. If Lindquist had built what you built—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. He mounted his horse and rode away. Jonas watched him go and felt something settle in his chest that he had not felt since Marta died. It was not pride. It was not triumph. It was the simple, exhausted knowledge that he had been right, and the cost of being wrong would have been everything. The questions began 3 days later. Nels Sorensen came first. He rode up with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that Jonas had never seen before, the look of a man who had laughed at something and discovered he should not have laughed. "I want to see it," Sorensen said. "The whole thing, from the inside." Jonas showed him. They walked the barn corridor together, and Sorensen pressed the walls the way everyone pressed the walls now. He examined the staggered bale joints. He studied the double flap entries. He crouched to look at the floor seams and the drainage underneath. "The hay stayed dry," Sorensen said. It was not a question. "The roof sheds. The drainage channels carry melt away from the base. The hay stays dry." "And the damp? The trapped air?" "Controlled venting. Low gaps for settling moisture. High gaps for rising warmth. The air moves, but the wind does not." Sorensen stood up. He looked at Jonas with an expression that was part respect and part calculation. "How thick do the walls need to be?" "Chest-high minimum, thicker on the windward side. The hay must be packed tight, tight enough that you cannot push a knife blade through without force." And the roof pitch? Steep enough to shed snow, shallow enough to stay lashed in wind. Ada Mercer showed me the angle. Sorensen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My barn sits 40 feet from my house. My wife crosses that yard 4 times a day in winter. She lost 2 toes to frostbite the year we arrived." Jonas understood what Sorensen was asking without Sorensen having to ask it. "I will show you how to build it," Jonas said. "Come back in 3 days with poles and planks. Bring your hay. We will start with the stakes." Within 2 weeks, half the district knew what Jonas had built. They came in 1s and 2s at first, neighbors who had heard rumors, who had seen Rourke's horse at the claim, who had noticed that Jonas's stock looked healthier than stock that had spent 3 days in an unconnected barn. They asked questions. How thick should the walls be? How low should the roof hang? How much opening is enough for air without bleeding heat? How do you keep the hay dry? How do you separate smokehouse ventilation from passage protection? Jonas answered every question. He showed them the corridor joints. He demonstrated the candle draft test. He let them walk the passages and feel the difference between sheltered air and open wind. He did not charge for the knowledge. He did not guard it as a secret or sell it as mystery. The method was not his invention. It was his adaptation, built from his mother's memory and Ada's teaching and his own desperate calculation. It belonged to anyone who needed it. The Sorensen passage was finished by the end of January. It connected house to barn with a single run, narrower than Jonas's, but built to the same principles. Sorensen's wife walked it the first night and wept. "I can tend the animals," she said. "I can tend them without fear." The Carlson family built a shorter version, just 20 feet, connecting their cabin to their root cellar. It meant they could access preserved food without crossing open ground in storms. The Henriksen claim adapted the design for a chicken house connection. Their birds survived February without a single loss to cold. Each adaptation taught Jonas something new. Each question forced him to articulate principles he had only felt. He discovered that he understood the system better after explaining it 10 times than he had understood it after building it once. Silas Bender's reaction was different. Word reached Jonas through a freighter passing through. Bender was telling anyone who would listen that luck had saved Jonas, not design. The storm had been bad, Bender said, but not as bad as it could have been. The corridors had held, Bender said, but they would not hold against a real test. Jonas had survived, Bender said, but survival proved nothing. Bender also raised his prices on hay, not by much, just enough to make corridor building more expensive for anyone who did not already have their own supply. Just enough to remind people that Bender controlled the margins. Jonas heard this and said nothing. He had paid his debt to Bender in full, the $12 plus interest, settled 2 days after the storm broke. He owed Bender nothing now. But Bender's resentment was not about the money. Bender had predicted failure. Bender had predicted fire. Bender had predicted that Jonas would come begging for coal oil before Christmas. None of it had happened, and now people were copying Jonas's method instead of buying Bender's supplies at winter prices. The hostile skeptic had not converted. He had doubled down. And Jonas knew that men who doubled down were dangerous in ways that men who admitted error were not. Ada came to see the completed system in early February. She walked more slowly than she had in the fall. Her breathing was heavier, but she walked the corridors with the same sharp eye, pressing walls, checking seams, examining every joint Jonas had repaired after the storm. When she finished, she stood at the cabin entrance and looked at him. "You rebuilt the smokehouse section correctly," she said. "The relief cuts, the bracing. That was not my teaching. That was your thinking. Your teaching gave me the foundation. I built on it." Ada nodded. Something in her expression shifted. a softening that Jonas had not seen before. When I heard the storm had hit, I thought of you. I thought, either he is dead or he has become what I hoped he could become. And now? Now I know. She reached out and pressed her hand against the hay wall, not testing it, but touching it, the way a person touches something they helped create. You do not need my eye anymore. You know where the wind will enter. You know how to stop it. Jonas felt his throat tighten. I would not have known any of it without you. You would have learned, slower, with more mistakes. But you would have learned. She pulled her hand back. That is the difference between a fool and a man thinking. A fool does not learn. A man thinking does. She left before dark. Jonas watched her wagon disappear down the track and felt the weight of something shifting, the weight of a teacher stepping back, a student stepping forward. He did not know it was the last time he would see her standing. Ada fell ill in late February. The sickness started as a cough and became something worse. Her daughter sent word. Ada was bedridden. Ada was not improving. Ada had asked to see Jonas before the end. He rode to her daughter's claim on the 1st of March. The snow was still deep, but the worst of the winter was past. The sky was pale and cold and very still. Ada was lying in a narrow bed near the stove. She looked smaller than he remembered, smaller and older and more fragile, but her eyes were the same, sharp, watching, thinking. You came, she said. You asked. I asked because I have something to say, and I do not have much time to say it. She gestured for him to sit. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat. When my husband died, Ada said, I thought I was finished. I thought everything I knew would die with me, no children of my own, no one who wanted to learn what I had learned. She paused to cough, a wet, rattling sound that made Jonas wince. Then I heard about a fool wasting hay on a corridor that everyone said would fail, and I went to see. You came to prove I was a fool. I came hoping you were not. She reached out and gripped his hand. Her fingers were thin and cold. You were not. And now what I know will not die. It will live in your corridors, and Sorensen's corridors, and every passage built by every hand you teach. Jonas could not speak. That is legacy, Ada said. Not children, not money, not land. Knowledge that passes from hand to hand. She squeezed his fingers. Promise me you will keep teaching. I promise. She held his hand for a long moment. Then she let go and closed her eyes. Now go, she said. I'm tired. And you have work to do. Ada died 4 days later. Jonas attended the burial with a dozen others from the district, neighbors who had come to her with problems over the years, families she had helped through hard seasons, people who remembered her sharp eye and sharper tongue. The ground was still frozen. They had to build fires on the gravesite for 2 days before the earth was soft enough to dig. Jonas helped with the digging. He did not speak. That night, alone in his cabin, he sat by the stove and thought about everything she had taught him. Compaction, moisture management, controlled openings, stillness. You are not building warmth. You are building stillness. The phrase echoed in his mind like a bell. It was the closest thing to a prayer he had left. The secondary crisis came in late March. A family named Dahl, 2 sections to the north, had a child fall sick during a late winter storm. The sickness was severe. High fever, shallow breathing, the kind of illness that killed children on the frontier. The father had ridden for a doctor, but the doctor was 20 miles away, and the storm was making travel impossible. The mother sent word through a neighbor. She needed help. She needed someone to tend the stock while she tended the child. She needed someone who could cross between buildings without losing time or heat. The dolls had not built corridors. They had heard about them, but had not believed they were worth the effort. Jonas rode to their claim through the storm. It took him 4 hours to cover ground that should have taken one. When he arrived, he found the mother half frozen from crossing between house and barn, the stock hungry and frightened, the child burning with fever. He did what he could. He tended the animals. He brought firewood into the house. He melted snow for water. He stayed through the night and into the next day, making the crossings that the mother could not make. The child survived. The fever broke on the second night. The doctor arrived on the third day and confirmed that the worst had passed. But Jonas saw what the dolls had lost: time, heat, strength. The mother had exhausted herself making unprotected crossings. The father had risked his life riding through the storm. The whole family had suffered because the space between buildings had become a barrier instead of a path. "Build the corridors," Jonas told the father before he left. "I will help you. Come to my claim when the ground thaws, and I will show you how." The father nodded. He did not argue. He had seen what the lack of corridors had cost him, and he was ready to learn. By April, Jonas had helped build or advise on 7 corridor systems across the district. Each one taught him something new. The Sorensen passage had shown him that narrower corridors worked if the packing was tight enough. The Carlson root cellar connection had shown him that even short passages made a difference. The Henriksen chicken house adaptation had shown him that the principles applied to any structure, not just barns and smokehouses. He improved his own design as he taught. Windward side thicker than leeward, a lesson learned from watching snow pile against the weaker walls of early copies. Drainage trench outside the base, a lesson learned from a corridor that flooded during spring thaw. Removable upper panels for shoulder season ventilation, a lesson learned from a passage that became stifling in mild weather. Double-braced corners where drift pressure was worst, a lesson learned from the smokehouse wall that had bowed during the January storm. Each improvement made the system stronger. Each teaching session made Jonas more articulate about why the system worked. He was no longer just surviving. He was becoming a provider. Bender tried to profit from the trend. By late spring, corridor building was common enough that people needed materials: poles, planks, rawhide, rope. Bender saw an opportunity. He began selling pre-cut corridor kits, bundles of poles and planks and instructions printed on cheap paper. The kits were bad. The poles were too thin. The planks were warped. The instructions were wrong. They described loose packing instead of tight packing, high roofs instead of low roofs, single flaps instead of double flaps. Jonas heard about the first failure in May. A family named Olson had bought a Bender kit and built a corridor that collapsed during a spring wind. No one was hurt, but the family lost a month of work and had to start over with proper materials. Jonas rode to the Olson claim and examined the wreckage. He saw immediately what had gone wrong. The poles were spaced too far apart, the packing was loose, the roof was pitched incorrectly. "Where did you get the design?" he asked. "Bender sold us a kit. He said it was based on your system." Jonas felt anger rise in his chest, not for himself, but for the Olsons, who had trusted Bender and paid the price. He helped them rebuild. He showed them the correct spacing, the correct packing, the correct pitch. He stayed 3 days until the passage was finished and tested. Then he rode to Bender's store. Bender was behind his counter when Jonas walked in. The smile appeared immediately, the same smile that had been there when Bender predicted fire, when Bender called in the debt early, when Bender raised hay prices to punish corridor builders. "Jonas," Bender said, "come to buy supplies?" "Come to tell you something." Jonas stopped at the counter. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply spoke. The Olson corridor collapsed. It collapsed because the kit you sold them was wrong. Bender's smile flickered. The Olsons built it incorrectly. The Olsons built it according to your instructions. Your instructions are wrong. Your poles are too thin. Your spacing is too wide. Your packing guidance is backwards. I based the kit on your design. You based the kit on what you thought you saw from the road. You never walked my corridors. You never asked how they worked. You guessed, and you guessed wrong. Bender's smile vanished. His face reddened. You cannot prove. I can prove everything. The Olsons have your instructions. I have the wreckage. Anyone who compares them to my corridors will see the difference. Jonas leaned forward slightly. If another family buys your kit and someone dies because the passage fails, what do you think will happen to your store? Bender said nothing. Stop selling the kits, Jonas said, or I will tell every family in this district exactly why they should not trust anything you sell. He left without buying anything. He did not look back. Bender stopped selling the kits, but he did not stop resenting Jonas. The resentment simmered through the summer and into the fall. Jonas heard about it in fragments, comments Bender made to customers, prices Bender raised for people who had copied the corridor design, credit. Bender refused to families who had asked Jonas for help. The grudge was petty, but petty grudges on the frontier could become dangerous if they festered long enough. Jonas let it simmer. He had other concerns. Ellen Torvik arrived in late August. She was a widow from 2 sections over, 32 years old, with a claim she had inherited from her husband when he died of pneumonia the previous winter. She had heard about the corridors. She wanted to build one before the cold returned. Jonas rode to her claim to assess the layout. He found a small cabin, a barn that needed repair, and a woman who asked sharp questions and listened carefully to the answers. How thick does the packing need to be? Tight enough that you cannot push a knife blade through without force. How do I know when it is tight enough? You test it. Candle draft test at different heights. Hand comparison between sheltered and unsheltered surfaces. Smoke observation to see where warm air settles. Elin nodded. She was taking notes on a scrap of paper, something Jonas had never seen anyone do before. She wrote quickly, her handwriting small and precise. And the venting? She asked. Low gaps for settling moisture, high gaps for rising warmth, covered with loose woven cloth so air moves but wind does not. She wrote that down too. They spent 3 hours walking her property, discussing placement, calculating materials. When Jonas left, he found himself thinking about her handwriting, the careful precision of it, the way she had listened without interrupting. He came back the following week to help with the stakes. She had already driven half of them. The placement was correct. You read your notes, he said. I read them 3 times. She handed him a mallet. Now show me what I got wrong. She had gotten almost nothing wrong. The stakes were spaced correctly. The floor line was level. The corner angles were sound. Jonas found himself coming back the following week, and the week after that. The corridor took shape under both their hands, his experience and her precision working together like 2 halves of a tool. They did not speak much at first. They worked. They tested. They corrected. But as September arrived and the passage neared completion, the silences became comfortable instead of awkward. Your wife, Elin said one evening. She died last year. Last August. I am sorry. I am sorry about your husband. Elin nodded. She was looking at the hay wall they had just finished packing, looking at it the way Ada used to look at Jonas's work, checking for flaws without finding any. He would not have built this, she said. He was a good man, but he did not think in new directions. He would have banked more earth and cut more wood and hoped it was enough. And you? I think in new directions. She turned to look at him. That is why I came to you. Jonas did not know what to say, so he said nothing, but something shifted between them in that moment, something that had been building without either of them naming it. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through shared work. They finished Elin's corridor in October. Then Jonas helped her repair the barn slats before winter. Then Elin came to his claim to help him add removable panels to his smokehouse passage. Then they planned spring planting together, comparing seed stocks and calculating acreage. There was no formal proposal. There was no ceremony with neighbors and officials. There was only an evening in late November when Elin stayed past dark, and Jonas asked her to stay the winter, and she said yes. They married the following spring, a simple arrangement witnessed by Sorensen and his wife. The district did not make much of it. Widowers remarried, widows remarried. The frontier demanded partnerships, and partnerships formed. But Jonas knew what Elin was. She was not charity. She was not convenience. She was a woman who thought in new directions and tested her notes 3 times and corrected her mistakes before anyone pointed them out. She was the partner Marta would have wanted for him, if Marta had been able to want anything at all. The second winter tested everything again. January of 1889 was not as violent as January of 1888, but it was hard enough. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single night. The wind piled drifts against every exposed surface. The snow fell for 2 days without stopping. Jonas and Elin tended the claim together. They crossed to the barn through the corridor. They crossed to the smokehouse through the corridor. They moved through stillness while the wind clawed uselessly at walls it could not breach. When the storm broke, they stood at the cabin door together and looked at the passages standing in the snow. It held, Elin said. It held. She reached for his hand. Her fingers were calloused from months of shared work, packing hay, driving stakes, testing seams. They were the hands of someone who had built something that lasted. What do we do now? She asked. We keep teaching, Jonas said. We keep building. We keep passing it forward. Elin nodded, and they went back inside, together, to tend the fire that warmed them both. Bender's reckoning came the following winter. The 1890 season was moderate by Dakota standards, but a cold snap in February caught Bender unprepared. His store had a detached warehouse where he kept winter inventory, flour, salt, lamp oil, the supplies the district depended on. The warehouse sat 60 feet from the store's back door across open ground. Bender had never built a corridor. He had mocked the idea for 3 years. He had raised prices to punish corridor builders. He had sold bad kits and blamed the failures on the buyers. Now he was crossing open ground 4 times a day to tend his inventory, and the cold was taking its toll. Jonas heard about it from Sorensen. Bender had frostbite on 3 fingers. Bender was moving slower. Bender's customers were complaining that he was not keeping proper stock because he could not make the crossing often enough to check his supplies. Jonas did not gloat. He did not visit Bender to offer commentary. He simply waited. The offer came in early March. Bender sent word through a freighter. He wanted to hire Jonas to build a corridor connecting his store to his warehouse. He would pay cash. Jonas rode to the store. Bender was behind his counter, but he was not smiling. His right hand was bandaged. His face was pale. He looked like a man who had been fighting something and losing. You want me to build you a corridor, Jonas said. I want to pay you to build me a corridor. Why? Bender's jaw tightened. For a long moment, Jonas thought he would refuse to answer, would insist on treating this as a simple business transaction, nothing more. But something in Bender's expression cracked. Something gave way. Because I was wrong, Bender said. The words came out like they cost him something. I sold against it before I understood it. I mocked it. I raised prices. I sold bad kits. He looked at his bandaged hand. And now I cannot cross my own yard without losing pieces of myself. Jonas said nothing. I am asking, Bender said. Not demanding, asking. Jonas considered. This was the man who had predicted fire, the man who had called in the debt early, the man who had tried to profit from bad copies and blame the failures on the buyers. But this was also a man asking for help, and Jonas had promised Ada that he would keep teaching. I will build it, Jonas said. No charge. Bender blinked. No charge? The method was never for sale. It was always free. Jonas turned toward the door. I will start tomorrow. Have your poles and planks ready. He left before Bender could respond. But as he walked to his horse, he heard Bender say something behind him. Quiet, almost too quiet to hear. Thank you. The Bender corridor was finished by the end of March. It was not the best corridor Jonas had built, but it was sound. The walls were tight. The roof was pitched correctly. The flaps were double-layered and weighted. Bender never became a friend. He never became an ally. But he stopped raising prices on corridor builders. He stopped mocking the method. He stopped pretending that Jonas had been lucky instead of right. That was enough. That was more than enough. The years that followed compressed into a rhythm. Jonas and Elin had children, a daughter in 1891, a son in 1893. The claim expanded. The corridors expanded with it. By 1900, the Halverson homestead had 4 connected passages: cabin to barn, cabin to smokehouse, barn to hay storage, and a new run connecting to a second cabin they built for the children. Jonas taught anyone who asked. He rode to neighboring claims and showed families how to drive stakes and pack hay and test drafts. He corrected bad copies and improved good copies and watched the method spread across the district like water finding low ground. He did not become famous. He did not become wealthy. He became something quieter, reliable. The man you asked when you needed to know how to stop the wind. Elin worked beside him for 30 years. She kept notes on every passage they built together. She organized the teaching sessions and tracked which families had adopted the method and which were still considering it. She was the precision to his intuition, the record to his memory. When she died in 1922, peacefully, in the same bed where they had slept for 3 decades, Jonas sat beside her body and held her hand and thought about everything they had built: the claim, the children, the corridors, the knowledge passed from hand to hand. Legacy, Ada had called it. Not children, not money, not land, knowledge. Jonas Halverson died in the winter of 1929 at the age of 80. He had lived long enough to see automobiles on the roads and electric lights in town, and tractors replacing horses on the larger farms. But on the Halverson claim, the corridors still stood. The grandchildren used them. The hay was still packed tight. The flaps were still double-layered. The stillness was still there, waiting to shelter anyone who understood what it meant. He died in his bed, in the cabin he had built 48 years earlier, with a granddaughter holding his hand. His last words were quiet, almost too quiet to hear. Check the lashes before dusk. She did not understand, but she promised anyway. And that night, when the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, she walked the barn corridor and checked every lash point by hand. The system held. It always held. By the time of Jonas's death, more than 40 families in the district had built some version of the connected passage system he had pioneered. Not all of them used hay. Some used straw bales, some used banked sod, some used whatever materials they had in quantity. But all of them followed the same principle: protect the movement routes, trap the stillness, deny the wind a path. The method never spread beyond the region. It was not written up in agricultural journals or promoted by land-grant universities. It remained what it had always been: local knowledge, passed from hand to hand, neighbor to neighbor, generation to generation. But for the families who used it, the difference was measured in lives saved, stock preserved, winters survived. The difference was measured in children who grew up without frostbitten fingers, and mothers who tended animals without fear, and fathers who crossed to their barns on January nights without losing themselves to the yard. Jonas Halvorsen was buried beside Marta and their infant child, in the same hard ground where he had broken 2 shovel handles 42 years earlier. The grave was dug by his son and grandsons. The service was simple. The neighbors who came remembered him as the man who had taken the yard away from winter. He had arrived in Dakota Territory with $43 and a wife and nothing else. He had lost Marta before he understood what he was doing. He had faced an impossible situation and found an unconventional answer. And when the north wind turned, his stock did not freeze in the dark. He did not follow them. Elias Rourke's prediction had seemed certain in the autumn of 1887. The cabin was too small. The barn leaked heat. The smokehouse sat too far from shelter. The woodpile was not enough. When the north wind turns, Rourke had said, your stock will freeze in the dark, and you will follow them. But on a January night in 1888, with the temperature plunging 60 degrees in 6 hours, and the wind screaming across the coteau, Jonas Halvorsen lifted a weighted flap and stepped into a corridor packed tight with hay. He walked from warmth to duty without surrendering himself to the storm. He moved through stillness while the wind clawed at walls it could not breach. He did not build warmth. He built stillness, and the stillness held. At night, in weather that once would have split his life into 3 exposed errands, Jonas lifted the latch, stepped into the muted, straw-dark corridor, and walked from cabin to barn to smokehouse and back again, his lantern steady, his face warm, his life connected. The wind had no path, and so the wind could not follow.